Welcome, everyone. My name is Dr. Laura Cohen, and I'm the Executive Director of the Harriet and Kenneth Kupferberg Holocaust Center here at Queensborough Community College. And our mission is to use the lessons of the Holocaust to educate current and future generations, you, about the ramifications of prejudice, racism, and stereotyping. And I'm very, very grateful to be here this evening to moderate a talkback after the play called Art as Archive. And I wanted to introduce two very special people. The first, who you already know, but I'm going to introduce him formally, is C. Julian Jiménez, who is a queer Puerto Rican and Dominican playwright. They hold an MFA in acting from the Actors Studio Drama School. They've had many playwriting awards, including the New Dramatist Residency, the Rita Goldberg Playwrights Workshop Fellow at the Lark, the Pipeline Theater Company Play Lab, LaGuardia Community College's LGBTQIA+ History Project Grant, Queen's Arts Council Grant, the Public Theater Emerging Writers Workshop Group, the Best New Work Motive Award. Many productions include Man Boobs, Nico Was a Fashion Model, Animals Commit Suicide, Locusts Have No King, Bundles of Sticks, Alligator Mouth, Tadpole Ass, also Fabuloso and the Barebacks, and Ronald Reagan Murdered My Mentors. They are a co-producer and co-writer of the hit web series Bulk and an associate professor and chair of the Communication, Theater, and Media Production Department here at Queensborough Community College. And thank you so much.
Thank you.
And joining us is Richard Shpuntoff, who was born and raised in Elmhurst, Queens, and was the official photographer of the Queen's Pride Parade for its first 20 years, 1993 to 2012. In 2016, he completed the feature-length documentary film, Julio of Jackson Heights, about the 1990 gay-bashing murder of Julio Rivera and its enormous impact on the LGBTQI+ organizing in Queens, which led directly to the creation of the Queen's Pride Parade. The film premiered at the Queens World Film Festival, where it won the Social Impact Award. And this is an amazing biography of you. And I think what I'm going to say is that we're going to talk a lot about your background in a moment, but to also just recognize that you've received funding support from Queens Council on the Arts for various projects in support of Queens Pride Committee's work on building awareness and understanding of the history of Queens Pride. And in 2016, he was awarded a special honor for service to the LGBTQIA+ community of Queens for over 2 decades, documenting and narrating the history of the community's struggle by the Queensborough president. And his most recent film, Everything That Is Forgotten in an Instant, had its New York premiere at the Documentary Film Festival of the Museum of Modern Art in New York City. Welcome, Richard. Welcome, Julian. And so, I wanted to acknowledge, Julian, when you came on stage before the performance, and you said to always say their names.
Yeah.
And I was thinking a lot about Next Benedict, and I was thinking a lot about Cecilia Gentile. And I wanted to just ask you, before we get into the conversation about Art as Archive, what does it mean to repeat people's names, especially in the theatrical moment?
Oh, no, it's absolutely important, because I think for so long, for so many years, queer people have been erased from history, and the atrocities that have happened to our community have been completely erased. So for me, it's really important to say people's names. It's the same way that I feel about the Black Lives Matter movement and George Floyd, and we need to remember these people, and not to make them symbols, but to honor them as who they were, as people in their community. And they became they became symbols even though they didn't want to be. Next Benedict is on my mind right now because it was just this past week. They were 16 years old. They had a life. And because of an anti-trans law happening in Oklahoma, it empowered their bullies in high school to beat them over the head, and they died. And now they are a symbol for, our community, but they're also a human being, which is why it's really important to say their names, to honor them. It's why I wrote this play after researching so much at the Wagner Archives and seeing Richard's film, and then reached out to Richard on Facebook, and we've only met this week for the first time, but have been talking since 2017. So it's great. And to really sort of document, even if it's in it's not a documentary what I wrote. These are imagined characters and about people that I know, the students I teach, my uncle from 1990 who lived in Elmhurst, and I imagine he went to these clubs with Julio. So that's where it came from, and that's why it's so important.
It really resonates a lot with me when you're talking about that. I remember, and I'm dating myself, but I remember Matthew Shepard. I remembered lots of people who are no longer with us who became symbols that they didn't want to become, but whose memory also catalyzed a movement. And Richard, when we started talking, your story is really interesting also because of who you are as a documentarian, but also you grew up in Jackson Heights. Can you talk a little bit about the journey to join us here tonight?
Sure. Is this work? I can't hear. Is it
You gotta put it close.
up close like this? That works now? Before saying anything else, because we had a pre-conversation a week ago, and I felt very focused and coherent, and I just wanted to... Louder? Are we doing okay? There we go. And before anything else, I just want to say congratulations. This was the first time I got to see the work. Really, it's going to be hard for me to focus on saying whatever I'm supposed to, because I still have... Congratulations to the tech crew and all the actors. It was wonderful. It was wonderful. And now I have to return to my own head somehow. So I grew up technically in Elmhurst by one block. You go down the block, you cross Roosevelt, then I would be in Jackson Heights. I have to kind of focus a little bit. When I was growing up in the neighborhood, there were like 6 to 8 gay bars, mostly gay bars. There was one lesbian bar in the neighborhood. Everyone knew about it. No one would talk about it in the straight community. There was what we called, for those of you who are younger, a cruising strip where people went to meet each other, where men would go to pick each other up and to meet and to socialize as well. PS 69 famously at one point was called the gay playground. And these were all things people wouldn't talk about, and yet we all knew about it. And I remember when I was very young, my mother would say, be careful, like walking down by 37th Road. 37th Road was also known as Vaseline Alley. It was the cruising strip. And I'd, it was like 13, 14, I'd be like, why am I going to be careful? And she said, because gay men have been murdered there, and no one's going to ask you, if you're walking by there, whether you're straight or gay. And I remember there were murders, and no one would ever talk about it being a gay bashing, but you knew it was because of where it happened. It didn't have to be said. So I grew up in this neighborhood where you had, and it was interesting because at the same time, just across the East River, you had gay liberation happening. And you had a lot of men in Jackson Heights who, when they were in the West Village, were out and proud and fighting the good fight. And then you came back to Queens and you were expected to act straight in public and be discreet in that way. So when my life went on and I moved and I lived other places and I returned to Jackson Heights in '93, which just happened to be the year of the first Queens Pride Parade. And I feel very lucky that I just happened to return at that time. And I was getting more serious about my work as a documentary photographer and a little bit as a photojournalist. And I remember seeing the flyer in a place called La Uruguaya. Now it's called Letty's little cafe, bakery cafe. And it was crazy. It was like, it was like a bake sale. It was like one of those flyers for a bake sale or a neighborhood puppet show, and it said, please join us for the first, I don't remember the exact words, but gay and lesbian or gay pride march and block party, it said, an international multicultural block party. And I was like, wow. And I went to photograph that first day as a photojournalist officially, but because I wanted to be there, and it was amazing. It was incredible, and it was so different from the Manhattan Pride Parade, which is a very, very important parade and historically very powerful. But this was like a small community parade, and it was very different because you knew people and people knew each other, and it was. It was just 3 years after Julio had been murdered and after a community had come together politically for the first time to pressure the police into investigating the murder of a gay man, which, I mean, the police, generally would just be like, oh, well, in the case of Julio, they wanted to write it off, and they said it was a drug deal gone bad. So I'll stop with that point. But that's kind of how I came into this, my work or I don't what I do.
And you started documenting for like 20 years, the parade, right?
Well, I mean, I'm still kind of, yeah. I did the first 20 years. I started when I was 10. That's a joke. Yeah, well, what happened, I mean, that first parade was so moving. I had called up the Daily News, had a photo, and then I called up the organizers. And I made some large prints of some photos. I said, this was incredible. I'd like you to have these. And they said to me, you're coming back next year, right? And I said, oh, okay. And next year became 20 years of photographing and filming the parade. And in the middle of that process, I eventually decided I wanted to make this film about the murder of Julio Rivera and its importance in how things changed in the community.
Well, and its importance because Julio's case was actually the first time it was tried as a hate crimes trial, and it succeeded. Is that right?
Yeah. It was the first successfully tried hate crime homicide in New York State, and there wasn't a hate crime law at that time.
And also, Julian, can you talk a little? It was absolutely reflected in the play, but can you talk about politically what really galvanized you at that time? We talk about the Reagan era, we talk about AIDS. Can you contextualize what it was like coming up at that time?
Yeah, and like at that time, in 1990, I was quite young, right? So, okay. I was a baby. No, I was young. I think I was 12. Yeah, I was 12. So, but I knew what was happening contextually even at 12 because I was hearing about things, and I knew my uncle was, even though the family didn't talk about it, no one said it. He had his friend Alan, right? But he lived in Elmhurst, all of this stuff. So there was always sort of rumblings, and I grew up on Long Island, and Long Island is quite conservative. So it was somewhat kept from me, but as I was growing up and going into high school, into like about 1996, and I came out in 1995 to my family and my high school, I was heavily involved in, I went to a Catholic school, and it was a quite progressive Catholic school, to be quite honest. We did a musical about the AIDS quilt in my senior year in 1996, and I played a gay man. I mean, it was wild, right? So, and I ended up singing with this high school at the AIDS quilt with a friend of mine, who's right over there, my friend Deneen, who also teaches here now. And I remember I stumbled upon a quilt panel with my uncle's name on it, and it was verified, even though I was told he had died of cancer. And since that moment, it has galvanized me to be want to document the history in the way that I document. And the way I document is through art and through theater as a writer. So my mission as an artist is to write about queer subculture, to write about queer people that have been forgotten and not centered. So that's how I feel. I feel like I'm archiving our history through theatrical characters.
And that's really important because so much of what is reflected in the play and what you're both talking about is living memory. And I know in our conversation we were talking about what happens in the aftermath of war, something called transitional justice, where society comes together to kind of rebuild itself through reforms, through policing or through institutional reforms or truth and reconciliation commissions. And in trials, there's this expectation that the trial of a crime, either of one person or against many people, will become the narrative of what people will learn about. But that's not what the point of a trial is. The point of a trial is to prove the innocence or guilt. And what we find with something called, which is more of a movement now about narrative change, is really looking at public history. How do people learn about history in ways that is relatable for them? And that can happen through memorials, and it can also happen through art. And Richard, can you talk a little bit about what it was like not only to document and photograph and eventually create this film, you're not part of the community, but you also are part of the community.
Yeah, I mean, there are two different things that happened. One was my work as a visual artist, photographing and filming, and you know, on that day I was part of the community. I mean, I just always felt a very strong connection, and it wasn't something I never questioned, but sometimes something you had to negotiate later socially as I was working more and more with the community and becoming more, and I had a very specific role in that, which is something, you know, that's interesting. How does one get involved when one, I mean, in the sense that, and this, well, let me jump forward. So one thing was photographing and filming, and then I felt also part of my role then was I loved working with the Pride Committee, and I was like, you need images, whatever you need, call me up, and I'll be there, and we'll bring the photos. So that was, so I felt I was doing something more than just documenting at the moment. But it kind of went hand in hand with how I was developing in terms of how I wanted to have how I wanted to create narratives, how I wanted to communicate. But what was very interesting for me, which I guess was the deep dive, was when I started working on the film, and because that gave me an excuse to talk to lots of people if they were willing to talk to me. This interesting thing that I'm heterosexual, but I grew up in the community. So having grown up as a kid from not just Queens, but from that neighborhood, made the conversations really great. And also that kind of heterosexual guy who a lot of people assume is bi or gay. And sometimes it would be very funny. I still remember I was interviewing this older man who's in Eric, who's in the film, who's from Denmark originally. And I went over to his place because he had all these great photos of being gay in the 60s and 70s with his lover at the time and his friends, and he was like getting out the photo album. I was filming, and he was talking all his stories. And at one point, I don't know what I said, he turns to me and he says, "You're not gay, are you?" And I was like, "Well, actually, no." And I said, "Is that okay?" And he said, "Oh, I don't mind." He said, and I had known him from the senior center, and he said, "But I don't know if you should tell the others. They might not be so comfortable with you." And I liked that. I liked the reversal from the norm, and I also liked the fact that he was like, "We'll have a complicit relationship. I won't tell the others not to ruin it." But it was interesting because for me, I felt like a lot of the time I was learning, I was following. I wanted to open the interviews. I wanted to learn. I mean, I was super curious because I'd known about this world. I remember being like 11 or 12 and we'd be like, "That's one of the bars." And we'd like go up and, "What are they doing?" "They're like sitting, drinking beer." "That's, you know," "So they looked, run. You know? So as a kid, you know, you were kind of curious, what is this world? And when I would learn all the stories of the bar was the magic touch, and it was closed by the time I was doing the interviews, but I loved listening to people tell their stories. I loved getting to document that stuff, and I thought, man, I missed Woodstock again, because it was this glorious, this beautiful experience. And for me, it was exciting to be able to honor, especially this older generation. Thank you. Yes, more. Oh, I have one open already.
Okay.
I'm fine. I'm fine. You just go on. No. But one thing that was so exciting was that a lot of these older people from that generation, they didn't necessarily have family albums with their families. They had all these experiences, but I almost felt like I was playing a role of letting them realize that this is significant and this is history. And so it was very, very exciting. I mean, for me, one of the most exciting parts of working on the film was that first part, and I would have done a whole film of just them telling stories.
Well, and the stories are critical, right? And you're talking about documenting and archiving people's stories, people who are living. And, you know, immediate memory, when we think about atrocity or mass atrocity or Holocaust survivors or people from other conflicts, at some point, the archive is all that exists. They're no longer here. Julian, can you talk a little bit more about the meaning of the archive? I know that it was the Wagner Archive at LaGuardia Community College and the significance of that.
Absolutely. What's so significant is that they were actual artifacts that I could look at and actually see from the times. And it's still going on right now with the consortium that Heather Huggins and I are running right now. We were doing an oral history with documenting students' lives in QCC and having interviews with them, and so that it can be put in the Wagner Archive, so that the queer community that's happening right now in 2024 at Queensborough is documented for future, so people know what it was like to be a community college student here in Bayside at this moment, 40, 50 years from now and beyond. And I was able to look at photos from the time. I was able to really research the time. That's how I came across Richard's film and was able to speak with them. So it really contextualized a lot for me. And I know Jackson Heights now. Like I was hanging out in Jackson Heights for a while in the early 2000s until now still. But not in the 90s. So it really helped me figure out what it was like, and then moving even beyond the archives into the research about what it was like during the Reagan administration, how sort of I had to navigate this. And this piece is somewhat of a companion piece to my play Ronald Reagan Murdered My Mentors, about growing up without a generation of queer mentors that were obliterated, either died by AIDS or put back into the closet, or one of my mentors was someone that I called up on the Long Island gay and lesbian switchboard, and he was just a voice on the telephone, and he was one of my strongest mentors who I never really got to see. Right? And then one of my other mentors was a theater teacher that was closeted and couldn't come out to me because they worked at a Catholic school. And then my other mentor died when I was 13, which was my uncle, of AIDS in 1990. So it's trying to patchwork. The archives helped me patchwork a history of how to be a queer person and have a queer body in this moment.
I'm having a reaction to this, and I'm trying to just kind of keep it together. I remember those times very well, and I'm thinking a lot about the intense similarities between now and then. Yeah. And I think one of the things you do very brilliantly in the play is you mirror these two things. You talk about the time of 1990, you also talk about the year of 2024, and I think that's significant. And also, can you talk a little bit about the politicization of art and the archive in particular? I'm thinking about authoritarian regimes where the archive in and of itself holds information, and it's up to governments whether they let you access that information or not. And you're talking also about the democratization of the archive and being able to access it.
Yeah, I mean, access is so important. So, one thing I remember, I wrote a web series with my friend who's over there about the queer community, and the web series we got notifications from people from this web series saying that they could not work. We got the website, the web series was banned in certain countries, and we've got flooded with messages saying, how can we see it here in Saudi Arabia? How can we see it here in this place? Because the government was denying access to these things, right? Like Italy was part of it, like Vatican City wouldn't allow it. It was banned. So when I think about archive and how accessible it can be, that's what I love about the Wagner Archives, is that you can go online and actually see everything just by searching in a Google, which is amazing. And it really helps. It helped me as someone who didn't have access. Look, my first job as a teen was at a library, and I was shelving books at the Levittown Public Library. And the reason I went for that job is so that I can sit in the women's studies section, because that's where the gay books were, and read Greg Louganis's memoir. Read everything. There was a book, I'm still looking for it. If someone finds it, gift it to me. It was called 1 in 10, and it was essays from gay teenagers. And I remember reading that book, changing my life, and I would pretend to shelve books and get paid minimum wage so I could read about myself, because there was no internet. So access is so important, and so many communities don't have access, and don't know they have access as well.
Well, and the archive in and of itself, though, is something static, that you have to go in and you're looking for something, or sometimes you stumble across something. And I wanted to kind of, Richard, talk to you a little bit about Julio. And we, in our conversation also, Julian, we were talking about Julio as a person. He's not a victim. He's become he's become a martyr in some respects, but also an activist. But a lot of these things happened after his death. Can you talk a little bit about the significance of who he was for the movement?
Well, one of the things I'll say that was interesting, because in the play, not only do we not see the violence that occurred, but we're told why we won't see the violence. And I found myself making decisions about what to include, what not to include. What, for example, my film doesn't focus on the trial, for example, which was a very important, very big deal, but it wasn't where I was going. And I remember one of the things I wrestled with for a while was, what is Julio's place in this story? Because Julio did not go out hoping to be murdered and change a community. That was not what he was doing. And there was even one point in an earlier version where I had very little about Julio. And I even had, I think I had a voiceover where I explained why. And I was very conflicted about it, about what that would be. And I was doing a work-in-progress screening of a shorter piece. And afterwards, we had a conversation. A friend of mine, Arthur Aviles, who's a dancer, said to me, he said, I want to talk about that. He said, if I had been murdered, I would want you to tell my story. And I thought, if it was Arthur, I would have, because he's a friend of mine. And that kind of changed it. Then it was like, okay. But even then, I was very interested in, how much I could say about Julio or how much, what to put in about Julio. And I'm trying to think now. I'm trying to review all the different things. It was important for me more than anyone else to feel him like a person, and not like a good person or a bad person, but a person who was loved. I felt that was the most important thing.
Totally. And I feel like that's the same way I was trying to approach it, especially in this last scene. That he does blow, and he does work at the bar, and Julio was a sex worker, and it was unapologetic about it. There's, the character in the play is labeled him and not Julio. The character name says him because in many ways it could have been any single one of them who was at PS 69. So, yeah. It was interesting. We just had a discussion. For the first time, we have a queer theater class, and I'm very proud that I got that passed through Academic Senate. Thank you. And the queer theater class came to the show yesterday, and we debriefed after, and they picked up all on the nuance of that and taught me about my play. I was like, whoa, I didn't know that was there. So it was really, it's great to pass on to the next generation. I mean, the next generation is why I'm doing this. Two people that I love dearly are in the back of the house right now. Joseph Distel and Vasilios Leon, who played Jay Heights. Joseph Distel was the stage manager. I call them my kids. they have come back as professionals, and so that I can be the mentors to them that I never had. So they mean a lot to me. I love you all.
I wanted to say something because now, like, just like Julian said, you make a piece of work and then other people point things out to you. And now I'm thinking, well, what was I doing in that bio of Julio? Because it was important to me not to make it about cause and effect. I didn't want anything to be like, he lived his life this way and that is why this happened. But now as I'm kind of thinking about it, because in the telling that I have, where it's everything from Julio losing his mom and being with his mom, to a lover of his who, he leaves and disappears on and goes off on like a drug binge, to how charming he was and how sweet he could be. And I think the thing that kind of was the common point thinking about it is what Julio evoked for people. That the fact I didn't care whether you thought, oh, good guy, bad guy, whatever. I wanted you to feel like people, he's a person like any person, and people had feelings for him, good, bad, and indifferent. And I wanted that to feel that way, like you had a sense of him, even if you didn't know his history in any detail.
Well, and I think that's really critical. I mean, I spent a lot of time focusing on Holocaust memory, and there's sort of two parts to it. One is preserving memories, and those memories are often in Holocaust literature and plays and museums. It's the preservation for people who remember, members of the community, but then there's also the activist part, which is inviting people into those spaces who don't know anything about the Holocaust and really making connections for them in their lives. That's really the critical piece here. That's why I do this work as well. We could continue on this conversation a lot, but I was wondering if anyone in the audience had a question for us. I'm just looking around, and some of you are rapt sitting forward. So I wanted to invite you to come a little bit closer and join the conversation.
Now everyone's shy.
Yes.
What was it like writing the play?
Strange. Because I didn't know what I was writing when I started writing it. Because it was part of the grant, so I received a grant from Danny Drum's office and LaGuardia Archives, and Danny Drum will be doing a talkback with me after the show tomorrow, who is a former council member of Jackson Heights, pioneer. You photographed him in 1993 at the first parade.
Co-founder of the Pride Parade.
And Queen's Pride House, right? So I got a grant to look through the archives and write and my pitch was to write a play on queer history. And I stumbled upon the archive for Julio. So, I was teaching a full load, which is a lot, as many professors here might know. So I would get up at 4 a.m. I would go to the office, get there by 5, and I would write until 9, until I just wrote pages and pages, and a lot of them were garbage. And then there was a nugget, and then I kept going and kept going and kept feeling influenced. And I kept trying to write about the murder and the trial, and then something clicked in me, and I was like, no, this is about the community. This is about the people reacting and what that feels like. Having Jimena and Amara in the play, like, being afraid to touch each other at the fruit stand because of what happened last night, and all of those things. And I just imagined how the community would react, and being at that time, and not feeling able to be open. So I just let it go, and when I finished writing it, the first draft, I didn't really know what I had, but I knew there was something. So yeah, it felt empowering. It felt like I found my history, and in a small way, especially through my uncle, who I didn't really get to know as an adult and as an out queer person, which sucks.
Anyone else have a question? All the way in the back.
The character Jay Heights, the physical embodiment of whole paper, to personify that,
Yeah, Miss Colombia. So yes, so Miss Colombia was, if you went to Queen's Pride Parade, you would see her full multicolored beard, dress, a parrot on her head or on her shoulder, this multicolored parrot, and she'd be roller skating down the parade, and I would see her all the time at Queen's Parade, and she would be in Manhattan Parade, she'd be everywhere. And she was wonderful, and actually, thank you for bringing this up. I started writing the play, and then at 5 in the morning, the very first time I went to write the play, and then the next day in the news, they found her body at Jacob Riis Beach. She was dead on the day I started writing the play, and I had envisioned her as the embodiment of Jay Heights. So yeah. That's where that inspiration came from, and with a lot of photos in the archives of seeing her, and then always just seeing her in the community. Yeah, when she left, it was like the next parade was really hard.
Just sitting with the intensity of this conversation and the amount of loss and sorrow and anger, but also what really comes across through your play, through just Julian knowing you, and Richard through the conversations that we've had, is also finding life, finding love, and finding a sense of celebration, and really claiming individuality. And
yeah, I just think that's what the queer community does, right? We take trauma and we remix it, and we find the irony in it, and we find the fabulousness in it, and we use it. It's the way we got by. At least, from what I see in history, it's just like there's an irreverence, there's a way that queerness processes trauma in a laugh, because that's the only way we can do it. So I wanted to embody that and celebrate the community in the play, and celebrate queerness, and not make it a woe is me, oh my God, we're always getting bashed. It's like, no, bitch, we will turn it out. Like, take your batons. I am still going to be wearing my stilettos and walking down Jackson Heights, and you can't stop me. It's like, look, it is not lost on me how I present at Queensborough as the chairperson of a department. This look is not accidental. It's important. It's important so that my students see themselves in me, and that knowing it's okay, I'm not going to blend in because other people might look at me in a certain way, or think that I'm not being respectful. It's advocacy through fashion.
And I want to add, just because I'm still very touched, I didn't know the Miss Colombia connection. And Osvaldo, I forgot Osvaldo's last name, was just an amazing, was just like a ray of light everywhere. And gender bended to the max, in drag, but with a full beard, and sometimes...
She had an engineering degree.
I thought she was a psychologist,
right?
But yeah.
Well, she told people a lot of things.
Whatever she was, she had a right to claim it. But I still, the very first Pride Parade, when my Spanish was not as good as it was now, I was photographing her, and she was just like riffing on me, and I'm just like totally just trying to follow whatever I could and laughing, because everyone's laughing, and I'm like, I'm missing the joke. Maybe it's on me. And and Randy Wicker, who's another interesting character in queer history, happened to videotape that. So I found a videotape of me with my long hair when I had it, photographing Miss Colombia, and her like just totally riffing with me.
I want to see that so bad.
I'll have to find it. But I love that. I love it because I grew up in the neighborhood. I love that she inspired a vision of the neighborhood.
are there any other questions? Yes.
It's not so much a question as more so a comment, but I just want to say thank you for betting on yourselves, and because I think a lot of the time it's interesting, because I'm thinking to myself, like, even like what happened like to Nex and what happened to Julio, and I wonder, even if it was film theater feels like it's a dying space, and it's only because, like for instance, we're seeing like movie musicals as a movie, but it's because people don't want to be in the theater, and there's like this missing link with people feeling like there's no call to action in the theater. And I think it's because the audience members keep looking for answers, but where the true love and light is in all the questions of what could happen if you leave us in this passing the baton. I think of information, education, and grounding ourselves in what is history, but also feeling as though that we need to also hold ourselves accountable for feeling like if something's happening, even if it is caught on camera, or even if it's not, or even if we think that somebody else that is part of that community will step in, that, that's not my place to, but, I don't know, if anything, it just makes me feel like, even though I'm a bisexual person, and there's times in which I don't feel like I have something to say on a certain topic, but caring is still enough, and I think that I don't know, I just hope that with this piece and it being in this community and in Queens and in New York and on the East Coast and with everything happening, I just hope that this kind of ripples out so that people can understand that even if you may not associate with a specific community, that caring is enough and still holding each other accountable, that, I still got your back in this, because that's what was missing for him. Had somebody just been fucking there, sorry, had somebody just been there, that stuff wouldn't have happened. And I feel the same way with Ness, and I'm so outraged that, had people just not felt accountable enough, because somebody in those 5 groups of kids that were beating on that poor child, could have said, you're doing too much, you know what I mean? So,
Yeah.
I just thank you for softening the human spirit and understanding that at the end of the day, we all just want love and belonging. So.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Can I?
Yeah.
So hi, I'm Ernie Jackson. I'm music production school. Okay, thank you. And this is Javi. This is our alumni music production. So I just have to say, I am so honored to meet you, sir, because Julian asked me to do this. And a week later, I'm just sitting home, because I don't have a life. I'm sitting home, and your documentary comes on the Oxygen Network.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And I was like, are you kidding me? Like, it was that quick. And the first thing I said to myself was, 1990, where was I? I was conscious, and it was just before I went to grad school in Connecticut. I was working in Lefrak City, and I learned so much, and it was just important to me that I knew this story, because I really was questioning, where was I that I didn't hear this? And I don't know how far Jackson Heights is from where Lefrak is, but I was still around. I was still conscious. Yeah. And even though you say you were 12, I was 25 back then. Okay, but thank you for this, because this is extraordinary for me. Nothing is ever not new to learn and understand.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ernie. You've been amazing.
Anyone else have a question or a comment? I want to thank you all for being here. Richard and Julian, thank you so much.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Laura.
Laura.
Oh my God.
And thanks to all of you for your comments. And I just want to reiterate the comments that you made about education and community. And I think that this moment in our society, in our global society, in our national society, and in our local society, we're losing each other. And community and empathy are the most important things. We can be completely intersectional. There can be so many ways that we have differences. But what brings us together is we're all human beings. And I really, really find that this play and your documentation of the community is really critical at a time when there's so much negativity around. So thank you for really spotlighting these voices and for just being wonderful inspirations.
Thank you for everything you do for our community, Executive Director of the Holocaust. You have to go to the Holocaust Center. It's incredible. And there's an amazing exhibit about queer people in the Holocaust that you should see. It's quite stunning. Thank you.
Be well, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.